You already know something has changed. You can feel it in the way your old routines feel like costumes that no longer fit. The conversations you used to lose yourself in now echo with something hollow. The relationships that once felt like home now feel like rooms you've outgrown but haven't left yet. And the worst part isn't that things have changed. The worst part is that you keep trying to go back. And every time you try, the distance between who you were and who you're becoming gets more unbearable. Carl Jung worked with people who reached this exact crossroads. They'd come into his office not because they were falling apart, but because something had shifted inside them and they couldn't undo it. They didn't want transformation. They wanted their old life back. They wanted the comfort of not seeing so clearly. They wanted to stop feeling like a stranger in a life they'd spent years building. And Jung had to deliver a truth that none of them wanted to hear. You can't go back. Not because you're not allowed to, not because some spiritual law prevents it, but because the consciousness that made your old life possible no longer exists inside you. The person who built that life, who tolerated those dynamics, who found meaning in those patterns, that person is gone. And no amount of effort, nostalgia, or desperate pretending will resurrect them. Today, I'm going to show you why Jung believed awakening permanently alters your psychological architecture, why the attempt to return to your former life causes more suffering than the awakening itself, and what actually happens when you stop trying to go back through a door that locked behind you the moment you walked through it. Jung observed something in his patients that troubled him deeply. The ones who experienced genuine psychological awakening, not the performative kind, not the kind you post about, but the real tectonic shift in consciousness. Almost all of them went through a period where they tried to reverse it. They'd taste clarity, see through a pattern that had governed their entire life, recognize a truth about themselves or their relationships that couldn't be unseen. And then, they'd panic. Because that clarity didn't just illuminate what was ahead, it made the life behind them unlivable. This is the part nobody warns you about. Awakening doesn't feel like ascending to some higher plane. It feels like someone turned the lights on in a room you'd been navigating in the dark for decades. And now you can see the walls, the furniture you've been bumping into, the door you thought led somewhere that actually leads nowhere, the people standing in corners you didn't know were there. You can see all of it, and you cannot turn the lights back off. Jung would have called this an irreversible expansion of consciousness. Once your awareness crosses certain thresholds, the psychological mechanisms that kept you comfortable in ignorance dismantle themselves. It's not a choice. It's not something you can negotiate with. The defense structures that allowed you to tolerate dysfunction, to ignore red flags, to participate in relationships built on performance rather than truth, those structures collapse when consciousness expands past them. And collapsed defenses don't rebuild. They can't. You'd have to forget what you now know, and genuine knowing doesn't work that way. Think about someone who spent 15 years in a relationship where they constantly minimized their own needs. They told themselves this was love. They told themselves sacrifice was noble. They told themselves their partner's inability to meet them emotionally was just how some people are. And then one day, something cracked. Maybe it was therapy. Maybe it was a book. Maybe it was a single moment of clarity in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. But suddenly, they saw the pattern. They saw that what they called love was actually fear of abandonment. That what they called sacrifice was actually self-erasure. That what they called acceptance was actually the same compliance they learned as a child to avoid punishment. Now try to put that person back into that relationship as if nothing happened. Try to make them unsee the pattern. Try to make them genuinely believe again that self-erasure is love. They can't. The recognition has altered them at a structural level. They might stay in the relationship physically. They might go through the motions. But something inside them will scream every single day because they now know what they're participating in. And that knowing is permanent. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the suffering of consciousness. Most people assume that awareness brings peace, that once you see clearly, life gets easier. But Jung found the opposite in his patients. Awareness brought a specific kind of agony, the agony of seeing truth while still being embedded in structures built on illusion, The agony of recognizing dysfunction you don't yet have the courage to leave. The agony of knowing you've outgrown your entire life, but having nowhere else to go yet. This in-between state was where most of the real suffering happened. Not in the unconscious phase, where ignorance provided a kind of anesthesia. Not in the fully integrated phase, where the person had rebuilt their life around truth. But in the middle, in the gap between seeing clearly and living accordingly. That gap is where people get stuck. That gap is where people try to go back. And the attempt to go back is what Jung found most destructive. Because going back requires you to suppress everything you've become aware of. It requires you to pretend you don't see what you see, to perform comfort you no longer feel, to participate in dynamics you now recognize as harmful. And this suppression doesn't just fail, it creates a psychological fracture that's worse than the original awakening. Jung documented this repeatedly. Patients who tried to return to pre-awakening states developed anxiety, depression, physical symptoms, addictions, dissociation. Not because awakening harmed them, but because the attempt to reverse it required them to wage war against their own consciousness. They were asking their psyche to unknow something it had already integrated, and the psyche responded with symptoms that were essentially emergency signals, alarms saying you are betraying what you now understand to be true, and it is destroying you. This is why you feel worse when you try to go back than when you accepted you couldn't. The exhaustion you feel in your old patterns isn't burnout. It's your psyche refusing to participate in its own suppression. The anxiety you feel around people you used to feel comfortable with isn't social difficulty. It's your consciousness recognizing incongruence between who you've become and who you're performing. The depression that settles over you when you try to resume your former life isn't chemical, it's existential. Your soul, for lack of a better word, is grieving the betrayal of its own evolution. Jung saw this pattern so often that he developed a specific framework for understanding it. He observed that consciousness, once expanded, rearranges everything it touches. Your values change. What once mattered intensely, status, approval, fitting in, being seen as successful, starts feeling hollow. Not because you decided it was hollow, because your expanded awareness can now see what those pursuits were actually compensating for. You weren't chasing success. You were chasing the feeling of being enough. You weren't seeking approval. You were trying to heal a wound that said you were fundamentally unworthy without external validation. When you see the wound beneath the pursuit loses its power to motivate you. And this isn't something you can undo by willpower. You can't reconvince yourself that status matters once you've seen that your obsession with status was a trauma response. You can't make yourself care about impressing people once you've recognized that your need to impress was a survival pattern from childhood. The motivation has been structurally dismantled. The engine that drove your old life has been taken apart, and you're standing there looking at all the pieces, knowing they'll never fit back together the way they were. Your relationships undergo the same irreversible shift. Jung found that awakened individuals experience something devastating in their existing connections. Relationships that functioned smoothly when both people were unconscious suddenly became intolerable when one person woke up. Because most relationships are built on unspoken agreements. I'll tolerate your dysfunction if you tolerate mine. I won't challenge your persona if you don't challenge mine. We'll both pretend this is fine because the alternative is too frightening. Awakening breaks those agreements unilaterally. You didn't sit down and negotiate new terms. Your consciousness simply expanded past the point where those agreements could hold. And now you're in relationships where you can see the contracts you never signed consciously, but have been honoring your entire life. The contract that says you'll always be the strong one. The contract that says you'll manage everyone's emotions. The contract that says you'll never ask for too much. The contract that says your needs come last. You see these contracts now, and you can't unsee them. Every interaction that once felt normal now feels like participating in your own diminishment. Every dynamic that once felt natural now feels like a script you've been performing without knowing it. And the people around you, the ones still operating under those old contracts, they don't understand why you've changed. To them, you haven't awakened. You've become difficult, distant, selfish. Because from inside the old agreement, someone who stops performing their role looks like someone who's abandoning the relationship. They can't see that you're not abandoning anything, you're just refusing to keep pretending. This is where the loneliness of awakening becomes almost unbearable. You're surrounded by people you love who cannot follow you where you've gone, not because they're incapable, but because they're not ready, and you can't drag them into awareness any more than someone could have forced you into it before you were ready. Consciousness doesn't transfer through explanation. You can describe what you see until you're exhausted, and the people around you will nod politely and then continue operating exactly as they were, because they haven't had the experience that changed your perception. They're still in the dark room, and you can't make someone see furniture they haven't bumped into yet. Jung would have called this the isolation of individuation. Individuation, his term for becoming psychologically whole, almost always involved a period of profound aloneness, not because the universe was punishing the awakened person, but because consciousness creates distance from unconsciousness automatically. You're now operating on a frequency that most of your existing relationships aren't tuned to. The conversations feel shallow, the interactions feel performative, the gatherings feel like theater where everyone knows their lines except you, because you've forgotten yours on purpose. And here's the part that truly makes return impossible. It's not just that you've changed, it's that your old life was built by someone who no longer exists. Every decision that created your current circumstances, your career, your relationships, your living situation, your social circle, was made by the unconscious version of you. The version that didn't see the patterns, the version that operated from wounds without knowing it, the version that chose partners based on familiar dysfunction, friendships based on shared avoidance, careers based on what would earn approval rather than what aligned with truth. That version of you built a life that fit them perfectly, and now you're standing inside that life as a different person, wondering why nothing fits anymore. It's not that the life got worse, it's that you got more honest. And an honest person can't live comfortably in a structure built by someone who was lying to themselves about everything. If this is resonating, if you're in that impossible space between the life you've outgrown and the one you haven't built yet, you might want something concrete to hold on to while the ground shifts. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed for exactly this kind of crossroads. When you can't go back but you can't yet see forward, sometimes what you need is a way to go inward. Click below to begin that work. Jung was clear that the grieving process in awakening is real and necessary. You are losing something, not an illusion, a life. A functional, operational life that worked well enough when you couldn't see clearly. And the fact that it was built on unconscious patterns doesn't mean it didn't contain real love, real connection, real meaning. It did. But it contained those things in a container that can no longer hold them. And that loss deserves grief, even as the awakening deserves respect. This is where many people get trapped. They oscillate between grief and growth, mourning and liberation, reaching backward and being pulled forward. Jung described this as a kind of psychological purgatory. You're not in the old life and you're not yet in the new one. You're in the hallway. And the hallway is terrifying because there's nothing to hold on to, no identity that fits, no relationships that feel right, no career that makes sense, no daily routine that doesn't feel like either regression or performance. People in this hallway made one of two choices. Some chose to go back. They suppressed their awareness, resumed their roles, re-entered the dynamics they'd seen through. And they spent the rest of their lives experiencing what Jung would have called a low-grade psychological suffocation. Alive but not living, functioning but not free, present but perpetually disconnected from themselves. The lights were still on. They just closed their eyes and pretended it was dark again. But closed eyes aren't darkness, they're denial. And denial after awareness creates a specific kind of despair that's different from ordinary unhappiness. It's the despair of someone who knows they're betraying themselves and does it anyway because the alternative feels too frightening. The other choice was to stay in the hallway, to endure the discomfort of not knowing, to tolerate the grief without numbing it, to sit with the terrifying blankness of a life that hasn't formed yet. Jung believed this was the only honest choice, but he never pretended it was easy. He acknowledged that the hallway period could last months or even years, that it would feel like failure to everyone watching from outside, that it would look like stagnation when it was actually the most active phase of psychological restructuring a person could undergo. Because here's what's happening in the hallway that nobody sees from outside. Your psyche is doing demolition and construction simultaneously. It's dismantling the structures that no longer serve you, the false beliefs, the inherited values, the trauma-driven patterns, the personas you perform to survive. And it's beginning to assemble something new, something that actually fits who you're becoming rather than who you were pretending to be. But this construction is slow. It's non-linear. It doesn't follow a schedule or a plan. You can't force it by reading the right books or doing the right practices or following the right teacher. It happens in its own time, at a pace determined by the depth of what needs to be rebuilt. And while it's happening, you feel like you're falling apart, because from the inside, demolition and construction feel identical. Both involve the disorientation of structures shifting. Both create instability. Both make you question whether something is wrong with you. The only difference is that demolition is destroying what was false, and construction is building what's true. But you can't always tell which is happening in any given moment. Jung emphasized that this is where trust becomes essential. Not trust in a spiritual sense, not faith in some higher plan, but trust in the process your own psyche is undertaking. Your consciousness expanded for a reason. The patterns you saw needed to be seen. The illusions that collapsed needed to collapse. And the discomfort you're experiencing now is the necessary consequence of a psyche reorganizing itself around truth rather than survival. There's a specific phenomenon Jung observed that makes this even harder. When you awaken and your old life becomes intolerable, the people in that old life don't just let you go quietly. They pull, they guilt, they pathologize your transformation. They tell you you've changed, and they don't mean it as a compliment. They tell you you're being selfish, that you're abandoning people who love you, that you're going through a phase, that you need to come back to reality. And their reality means the old agreement, the one where you stay small so they can stay comfortable. This pulling is often the hardest part of awakening, not the internal shift that, while painful, has its own momentum, but the external resistance. The people you love actively working to reverse your transformation because your growth threatens the system they're embedded in. Your mother who needs you to stay the compliant child. Your partner who needs you to keep carrying the emotional weight. Your friend who needs you to stay on their level so they don't have to confront their own stagnation. These aren't bad people. They're unconscious people reacting to a perceived threat. Your awakening disrupts their equilibrium. When you stop performing your role, the entire relational system destabilizes, and systems want to maintain homeostasis. So the system pushes back, through guilt, through anger, through weaponized love, through concerned conversations that are really interventions designed to put you back in your place. This external resistance was the final test of whether someone would complete their transformation or collapse back into the old pattern. Because the pull of belonging is almost impossibly strong. We are social creatures. We need connection, community, being known. And awakening, at least initially, threatens all of that. It asks you to choose truth over belonging, authenticity over acceptance, self over system. And that's an almost inhuman ask, which is why so many people fail it. They feel the pull, they hear the guilt, they see the pain in the eyes of people they love, and they fold. They go back. They put on the old costume. They perform the old role. And the door that opened inside them doesn't close. It just gets ignored. The light stays on. They just stop looking. But some people don't fold. Some people feel the pull and stay anyway. Not because they're stronger, not because they care less, but because something in them has shifted past the point of return, and they know, with the bone-deep knowing that awakening produces, that going back would kill something essential in them, not their body, their soul, their connection to their own truth, the thing that makes them actually alive rather than just functioning. Jung believed these people had crossed what he called the threshold of irreversibility, the point where the cost of returning exceeds the cost of continuing forward into the unknown. And reaching this threshold is not a choice anyone makes consciously. It happens when enough truth has been integrated that the old life becomes not just uncomfortable, but genuinely impossible. Like trying to fit a grown adult back into childhood clothes. The body simply won't allow it. The psyche simply won't compress back down to the old dimensions. What actually waits on the other side of this impossible passage isn't what most people expect. It isn't enlightenment. It isn't perpetual peace. It isn't the spiritual fantasy of rising above all difficulty. What waits is something Jung considered far more valuable and far more demanding. Authenticity. Authentic life. Life built on consciousness rather than unconscious pattern looks completely different from the life you left. It's smaller in some ways. You have fewer relationships, but the ones you have are built on actual truth rather than mutual avoidance. You may have less status, but what you do aligns with who you actually are rather than who you were performing. You experience less excitement but more depth, less drama but more meaning, less certainty but more honesty. Jung didn't romanticize this. He acknowledged that authentic life is harder than unconscious life in many ways. You can't hide behind personas anymore. You can't blame others for your circumstances because you see your own participation too clearly. You can't numb yourself with the old distractions because awareness has made them transparent. You're living with the lights permanently on, and some of what you see isn't beautiful. Some of it is your own shadow, your capacity for selfishness, manipulation, cowardice, cruelty. The parts of you that were easy to ignore when you were focused on performing goodness for others. But Jung believed, and his life's work demonstrated, that this difficult, stripped-down, fully conscious life was the only one worth living. Because everything else is performance. Everything else is borrowed identity, inherited values, unconscious repetition of patterns someone else installed in you. And a performed life, no matter how comfortable, has a hollow center that nothing external can fill. You felt that hollowness. That's what started this whole process. That's what cracked the foundation of your old life. Not a book or a teaching or a practice. The hollowness itself. The recognition that you were going through motions without being present. Living a life that looked right from the outside but felt wrong from the inside. That recognition was the first light turning on. And everything since, the discomfort, the grief, the loneliness, the impossible feeling of being between lives, has been the consequence of that light refusing to go out. So, what does Jung's work ultimately tell you about this place you're in? About this impossible gap between who you were and who you're becoming? About this grief for a life you can't return to and a future you can't yet see? It tells you that you're not broken, you're in transition. And transition, by definition, means you're not anywhere yet. You're in the hallway. The door behind you has no handle on this side. The door ahead of you hasn't fully materialized yet. And the only thing you can do, the only honest thing, is to stay in the hallway without going numb, to feel the grief without letting it pull you backward, to tolerate the uncertainty without manufacturing false answers, to trust that the same consciousness that showed you the truth about your old life will eventually show you what your new life looks like. This isn't easy. Jung never said it would be. He said it would be real. And real is the one thing your old life never was. Not entirely, not at its foundation. It was functional. It was familiar. It may even have been happy in moments, but it wasn't built on truth. And now that you've tasted truth, functional and familiar aren't enough anymore. They can't be. Something in you won't allow it. That something is your consciousness. Expanded, irreversible, relentless in its demand for honesty. It won't let you sleep again. It won't let you pretend again. It won't let you shrink back into a shape you've already outgrown. And while that feels like a curse right now, while you'd give almost anything for one more day of comfortable ignorance, Jung would tell you it's actually the most important thing that has ever happened to you. Not because it feels good, because it's real. And real, for all its difficulty, is the only ground solid enough to build a life that won't collapse under the weight of your own awareness. You couldn't go back even if you wanted to. And somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the loneliness, beneath the terrifying blankness of the hallway, you know you don't actually want to. You just miss the comfort. And comfort and truth have never been the same thing. That door behind you is closed. It has no handle on this side, and the grief of that is legitimate. But so is what's ahead, even if you can't see it yet. Especially because you can't see it yet. Because for the first time in your life, you're not building towards something you were told to want. You're waiting for something real to emerge. And that waiting, as unbearable as it is, might be the first honest thing you've ever done. If you're in that hallway right now, between the life you can't return to and the one that hasn't formed yet, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was written for exactly this place. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's teachings, designed not to rush you through the passage, but to help you stay present inside it. Because the way forward isn't around the uncertainty, it's through it. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.